Hello and welcome to this webinar about key issues in reusing data. I'm Sarah King-Hill and I'm presenting today with Maureen Haker, and we both work for the UK Data Service. So here's an overview of what we're going to talk about in this webinar. We're going to start briefly talking about secondary data, and then I'm going to concentrate on issues around reusing quantitative data types. And Maureen will consider issues around reusing qualitative data, though many of the issues are in fact the same, such as do I understand my data, where has it come from, and is it appropriate for my analyses. As I said before, a recording of the webinar and our slides will be available from our website. So that's ukdataservice.ac.uk under News and Events. If you click onto that, choose Events and then Past Events and then find this webinar, you should be able to see the recording there and slides. So we're planning to talk for about 30 to 35 minutes and then we'll answer any questions you might have. So you can type your questions in at any point and we'll try and answer them as many as we can at any event at the end. In order to type in questions, you should see a box that appears to the top right of your screen. If you can't see one, then try pressing on the red, I think it's a white arrow on a red background, or it might be a red arrow. At any events, one of those. So if you click on that, that should bring up the questions box, and if you type that in, then we'll try and answer that at the end. Okay then, so this is about reusing data, and it's also referred to as secondary data analysis. So where does the data come from? The data comes from data collectors, and for data collectors, the data are primary data. And that means it's data that's been collected for specific research purposes. So data collectors include research organisations such as NatSem, official statistics organisations such as the Office for National Statistics, or ONS, and also academically driven projects such as Understanding Society, which is a major longitudinal study of households in the UK based at the University of Essex. Data can also come from individual researchers and from research teams. So, for example, Peter Townsend did seminal research on poverty. So, in addition to primary research, data is often archived so it can be used by others in secondary data analysis. And through data sharing, we're able to reuse data. So, for example, here we can see Hans Roslin, who used to produce really engaging graphs showing changes in health and poverty over time. Okay, so there are pros and cons to in secondary data analysis. You can use data that you couldn't collect yourself. So, for example, secondary data analysis allows you to use data collected from different points in time and across different countries. So, if you're interested in looking at working conditions over time, archived data from surveys such as the Labour Force Survey, which goes back to the early 1970s, provides data that couldn't be collected now, and therefore sometimes reusing available data is actually the only option that we've got. Similarly, single researchers or research teams don't generally have resources and expertise needed to produce major data collections. Secondary analysis is also cost efficient. The UK Data Service collection includes surveys with samples in the thousands, and they can be downloaded from the website after a short registration process. You can also obtain very high quality data. So data from the main collection at the Data Service undergoes check for quality and clarity. And most collections come from trained researchers and methodologists from universities, government departments, stats authorities and research organisations. And together these advantages can provide a reason to consider if you can make use of some of the extensive data available. There's also the ethical issues that have been dealt with by the data producer already. However, there are some disadvantages to secondary data analysis. The first one obviously is that the data you need actually might not be available. There may be some data available, but it's not actually perfect for what you want to use it for. So, for example, it might be older than you'd like, or the wording of a question might not be quite ideal for your needs. And in these situations, the data may still be the most suitable for your research, but you need to compromise on or acknowledge the limitations. Also, as you were not party to the data collection, you won't have an insider's knowledge. So you need to make an effort to get to know the data, which in practice means consulting closely with any data documentation. The issues around ethics still apply. Issues around confidentiality can limit the data you can access. So there might be limited information about low-level geography, for example. So together, the key issues as secondary data analysts are making an effort to get to grips with the data and being pragmatic about whether data are good enough for your purpose. So let's look quickly at the research process and how this fits in. So we start off with a research question and we locate data, and then we evaluate the data and finally conduct our analysis of the data. So is this a linear process? Well, sometimes it can be, but it isn't always. You might find, for example, that the data for your research question might not actually be found or might not exist. So that means that you might have to tweak or redesign your research question. Also, further evaluating the data, you might discover that the data is not quite what you wanted, and that might also lead to further tweaks or redesigns of the research question. And also, when you do your analysis, you might also reveal also further issues with the data that you want to use, in which case you might again have to go back to your research question and tweak it a little bit in order to make it work with the data and the analysis. So something that you must do is to familiarise yourself with the relevant documentation to make sense of your data. So basically this is to understand the meaning of the data and to evaluate their suitability for your research question. So you have to understand exactly what information was collected, from whom, when and where, and what was done to the resulting data afterwards before you got to it. So all of this information is available in the documentation, which is listed with each data set. So now I'm going to talk about quantitative data, more specifically, and my colleague Maureen is going to talk after this about qualitative data. So this is going to take the form of a brief case study and talk a bit about what data is available and what sort of documentation is available, and the key issues that you should be thinking about when we're using these kinds of data. So first of all, case study. So here we have the Crime Survey for England and Wales, which is a survey that has been run for a number of years. It started off as called the British Crime Survey, and it started off in the 1980s and has been run most years, I think certainly since the early 2000s. And this gives crime statistics independent from reporting to the police. It's an annual survey, as I say, since at least the early 2000s, and it is also conducted throughout the year, although the actual data are available yearly. And the number of individuals involved are 35,000 people who are interviewed aged 16 plus, and 3,000 aged 10 to 15. And what this survey does is it asks about crime experienced in the last year. And the data are stored as individual level anonymous records. And you can see the example of this at the bottom of the screen here. This is just a small screenshot of a small part of the data. And the kind of data that I'm talking about here, this is the representative of it. So you can see in the first row we have an individual who was female, aged 27, with one child, who appears to have been living in their particular area for 2 years, but less than 3 years, and so on and so forth. Most of this data is available via the website just to be downloaded, but there are different access conditions for more sensitive data. Okay then, so this particular data set was used for this study. If you were to follow the link at the bottom here in the PLOS ONE journal, you'd actually see the whole article. And this is an example of how Hind Khalifa and colleagues actually reused some of this data. So what was the data they used? It was the British Crime Survey, as it was called at the time, 2009-10. They used the special license data, which is a particular version of the data that means that you have to jump through a few extra hoops to get it, and that's because it covers a particularly sensitive topic in this instance, I think, or might be potentially more disclosive. There were 46,000 adults, 16 plus, that you used, and just over 9,000 of those had at least one limiting disability. And this case study was about victimisation and disability. So what were the findings? It was adjusted for age, sex, socioeconomic characteristics. The study showed that disability increases the risk of experiencing violence, and the levels of victimisation were highest amongst those with mental health problems. And it's estimated that 116,000 victims of violence were attributable to disability. So you can go along and actually read that, and you can see for yourself exactly, they explain in detail what their methods were and what data they used, and so you can see for yourself exactly what they did. Okay then, so there are different kinds of quantitative data that are available, and they're suitable for different kinds of analyses. So to examine individuals, families, households or businesses at one point in time, you can use cross-sectional survey data or census microdata. That's a sample of the individual census data. If you want to look at trends over time, there are repeated cross-sectional surveys. We call these kinds of data UK surveys in our catalogue. For example, the Crime Survey for England and Wales has run since the 1980s. If you want to be able to follow individuals over time, then you want longitudinal data. Understanding Society is an example of this kind of data. It follows people in 40,000 households and covers a very wide range of topics. So for small geographic areas, the census aggregate data and flow data are a good source. And to compare countries over time, there's a collection of international macro data such as the World Bank indicators. So to find out where, when and why were the data collected, you need to go to the catalogue record, which you will find with the data set on our website. So basically you can see who collected the data. You can also see the area that was covered if you go down to, if you scroll down the screen to the coverage university methodology. You can see when the survey was conducted. And also there should be an explanation on that page as to why the data were collected, what the main objective was to collect the data. Here's an example of something that you will see when you go to look at documentation. So all documentation is slightly different depending on which the survey is. All different data producers tend to have slightly different ways of documenting their data. There are certain things that you should always find. Things to understanding your data is understanding who was asked what questions. So this is a small part of the questionnaire for the 2014 Quarterly Labour Force Survey. All the documentation does vary, as I say. In this case, it gives the name of the variable, which you can see is called flex10, and the exact wording of the question and the range of answers with the coding. If you look below, it says that the question applies if the respondent is in work, and then it gives you then the definition of someone who is in work. Okay, computer-aided interviewing makes it easy to send respondents through the questionnaire by different routes, depending on their answers. Note that many questions may only be applicable to some of the sample, and that this might lead to missing data. So what was done with the data after it was collected? Well, something you should always be able to find out information about from the documentation is derived variables. And derived variables are data, or variables rather, that have been created from the raw data. So here we have another example also from the Labour Force Survey about how flex W7, whether the respondent works a 0-hour contract, and how this was actually derived. So you can actually follow this flow diagram through, and it uses a variable called flex10. And if you were to follow that through, you'd be able to see exactly how all the different categories for flex W7 were actually created. Okay, and there are also sampling considerations that we must take into account. Generally, surveys are based on samples, so they're never, or almost never, the whole population in question. So you need to ask a few questions. Is the sample representative? Who is included? Do you need to apply a weight to make the data representative? And you also need to think about the response rate and bias. Another thing you might want to think about is, do you have enough cases to make a precise estimate? So this is particularly important for small subpopulations. So for example, if you were looking at some small ethnic minority that was identifiable by the question about ethnic classification in the survey, you might find nonetheless that you just don't have enough people in that group in order to do any worthwhile analysis, particularly if you were, say, limiting it to a particular age group or women only or people with disabilities or something like that. Okay, and in red at the bottom of the slide you can see we have some guides which might help you with some of the issues around sampling. So we have some guides and a video, in fact, about survey weights and also a guide about complex sampling. Okay, so here are some references and resources for the things I've been talking about. As I say, the slides should be available online after this. As I say, go to our website, look under news and events, events and past events. And I'm now going to hand over to Maureen to talk about reusing qualitative data.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Maureen Haker. I'm a lecturer at University of Suffolk, and I'm going to talk about very similar things, but specifically for qualitative data. So first, I'm going to go through a few different types of qualitative data reuse projects that I've seen in my time working at the UK Data Service. Then I'm going to walk through a case study that showcases basically one of those types of reuse. I'm also going to do a quick overview on how you can get started reusing qualitative data, which will address a couple of the key issues that arise when reusing qual data. And finally, I'm going to show you a couple of tools that we've developed to help qualitative researchers. It's probably worth pointing out that qualitative data is not particularly common, and certainly we can see from the poll that we had earlier that nobody had just reused qualitative data only. But it is something that's becoming more common. And so hopefully you'll find some of the tools that I introduced at the end to be of particular use for you and perhaps inspire you to bring you over to the dark side of qualitative research. There's many ways that you can reuse qualitative data. You can quite simply give a description or an understanding of a particular social and historical point in time. This is useful because you can see more of the data than just what publications reveal. So you might not be able to see all of the data depending on what's available in the archive or what you have access to, but you can certainly see more data than what was originally published. And this is useful because you won't be limited to what researchers thought was salient for their research questions and topics. You can explore it a bit further and see what would be of interest to your own research questions, and therefore give you a greater historical and social context to your research project. Another way to reuse data is to consider analyzing the methods used and look at the lessons that might be gleaned about the most effective ways of, for example, sampling or data collection methods, or even just developing topic guides. One thing that's especially valuable is to look at how an interview was laid out before the interview was conducted. So that is, what sorts of questions did the interviewers thought they were going to ask, and then look at what they actually asked in the interviews. There's many reasons why certain questions are not asked in interviews, and some interview schedules are designed to be much more flexible. You know, sometimes a tangent comes up and you want to interrogate that further, so you deviate from your interview schedule. In any case, it's an important researcher skill to have that kind of intuition to know what to do. And you really can't see that unless you start comparing interview schedules with actual interview transcripts. Another reuse is called reanalysis. And this looks at the wide range of approaches you can take in the analysis of a data set. It usually means asking some kind of different research question from what the original researchers were trying to do. So for example, Seal and Charteris Black did a study using comparative keyword analysis of illness narratives. The original illness narratives had been looked at exclusively for health research. So they were specifically interested in what sorts of symptoms and diagnoses came about. When Seal and Charteris Black came along to do the comparative keyword analysis, they were much more interested in an analysis of the discussions between the doctor and patient than the actual health issues that came up in the interviews. So the question can be very different in that sort of way. Or sometimes the question can be on a similar topic to the original research, but have a slightly different focus. So for example, Joanna Bornat looked at gerontology as a topic and found 2 different data sets looking specifically at this topic. However, her focus was on racism within gerontology, which wasn't the focus of the original work, but the data set was rich enough to allow her to explore this theme within that existing data. Finally, data can also be reused for teaching and learning. So Joe Haynes is one person who does quite a bit of that. It gives students the opportunity to work with real data and also gives them some hands-on experience working through analysis of data and the types of issues that arose from methodological choices. There's a number of teaching data sets available through our website, as well as other teaching resources which use archive data to walk students through various methodological and thematic issues. There is a 5th type of reuse, which is exemplified in this case study I'll go through with you. And this case is a restudy, which is where you replicate the methods of a study for purposes of comparison. You may be looking at a historical comparison, which could help you demonstrate how society has changed over time, or it could be geographical, social class, or comparison with any other variable, basically to just show differences between subgroups. This example of this kind of reuse project is from the project School Leavers Study. The original study was conducted by Ray Paul in the late 70s as part of a much wider community study on the Isle of Sheppey. The UK Data Service holds a number of collections related to this community study, but the School Leavers Study specifically looked at student aspirations. Paul asked teachers to set a particular essay just before students were due to leave school, prompting them to imagine that they were reaching the end of their life and something had made them think back to the time they left school. They were then assigned to write a short essay of what happened in their life over the next 30 to 40 years. In 2009, Graham Crow and Don Lyon, and that's Graham Crow with Ray Paul in that picture, decided to reanalyze this data set and focus solely on student aspirations. Using the very same methodology, they conducted a restudy on school leavers for students on the Isle of Sheppey in 2009. The prompt supplied to students in 2009 during data collection was nearly the same as what Ray Paul had intended. So the prompt was to imagine you're you're nearing the end of your life and reflect back on what you've done since leaving school. They then transcribed those essays and compared the themes from this set of essays, the new set of essays, to the set of essays that was collected by Ray Paul. And you can see here the wording of the prompt and a small snippet of what one essay looked like. The findings definitely showed a shift in aspirations, as you might imagine. Here's just a few details of what they received back. So a fairly similar number of essays. In 78, there was slightly more essays. And in 2009 to 2010, they had a much more even split between the genders. But interestingly, both data sets covered the same general themes that you can see at the bottom there of health, education, career, and family and leisure. But of course, they covered these themes in very, very different ways. But how exactly were they different? Well, in 1978, students expected much more grounded and arguably mundane sorts of jobs. Career progression was gradual and followed on from hard work, and sometimes there were talks of periods of unemployment or even death. And you can see a few of the examples in the left column of some of the quotations from those essays, such as the one at the bottom. I longed for something exciting and challenging, but yet again, I had to settle for second best. I began working in a large clothes factory. 2010, however, showed students imagining well-paid and instantaneous jobs filled with choice, but also with some uncertainty. Crow and his research team also noted a clear influence of celebrity culture in those essays. So, for example, you have the quote at the bottom of a girl who writes, "In my future, I want to become either a dance teacher, a hairdresser, or a professional show jumper, horse rider. If I do become a dancer, my dream would be to dance for someone really famous like Beyonce." The impact of this study, however, spans beyond the interesting changes that they've noted in young people's aspirations. Their study was part of a much bigger community project on the past, present, and future of the Isle of Sheppey. The goal was to engage the community alongside this research and find innovative ways to continue including participants in the research outputs. As part of this initiative, they published the Living and Working on Sheppey website, which has videos and artwork produced by the residents of the Isle of Sheppey, as well as ways for those who participated in the research in the past to stay in touch with each other and read about the history of their community. They helped to create a shared history and memory of what living on the Isle of Sheppey means among this community. There's a number of publications out where you can read a bit more about the project and the results of the study. As I've said, this case study demonstrated just one of the ways of reusing qualitative data, which is a complete restudy and comparison between those data sets. I know I've gone through this quite quickly, so if you'd like to have a closer look at any of those slides, we'll post the slides from this webinar on the News and Events page on the UK Data Service website. Okay, so we've covered the different types of reuse projects you can do, but what about actually doing secondary analysis? As with quantitative data, the first thing you'll need to do is to orient yourself to the original research project. I think the main point to make here, which is very much the same as reusing quantitative research, is not to underestimate the amount of time it will take to get acquainted with the data set. There may be multiple levels of context to get through in order to really understand the data. And what I mean by that is you'll have more than just the data that's collected at the time of the interview or data collection, but you may also need to consider the metadata of the participants, or the historical time period in which that data was collected, or where the data was collected. So really the idea is that you really need to understand the data set as a whole in order to get at what the root of what the data can convey. So it's not just about acquainting yourself and reading through interview transcripts, it's also contextualizing that within the larger data set, and then contextualizing that data set and the project within the time and place that it was conducted. The documentation provided with the data set will be a really useful starting point for this. It often contains more information about the methodologies. So there might be the interview schedule or a call for participants, or sometimes it includes segments from publications that arose from the original study, or it might also have funding applications or progress reports. I've also seen some studies which have sections where the principal investigator focused on a particular feature of the data set. So for example, they may have focused on the sample. Annette Lawson conducted a study in the 1980s on adultery, and given the sensitivity of the topic, the sampling did become a primary focus for her. So she ended up writing a 56-page document that just focused on her sample, and she did a comparison with larger national numbers to talk about the representativeness of it, and she also addressed some of the practical and ethical issues that arose from the way she sampled. In my time working with qualitative data sets at the UK Data Service, I've also seen background contextual material taken from the area of research. So there might be, for example, meeting minutes, government pamphlets, letters from participants. And again, all of this just helps to paint a picture of what's going on around the study. You may also need to consider the sample. So, for example, if the data set is particularly large, you may need to take a subsample of this. This is probably not as much of an issue with qualitative research as it is with quantitative research, since they're usually smaller studies anyways, but there are some collections which have got quite a large amount of funding, and you'll need to carefully consider what's actually feasible for you to look at. For example, the Edwardians, which is long hailed as the the oral history project of Britain, has over 400 in-depth interviews. So they're quite lengthy, and it would probably not be very feasible necessarily to go into it thinking that you were going to get through all 438 interviews. But you could take a sample of that, and you might consider, looking at particular participants, so perhaps single mothers that were interviewed for the Edwardians collection, etc., etc. Conversely, you might also find interviews from different data sets which complement each other and would make a really nice new larger data set that's useful if you combine those different interviews. So you don't have to stick within just one collection. You can sort of pick and choose, provided that those interviews complement each other. Okay. Finally, you'll need to think through how you will approach the data. Whether you use an inductive strategy where you start with the data and see what comes from that, or a deductive strategy where you have a firmer idea of what you're looking for in the data. So this was a very brief overview of a couple of issues that come up when you're getting started reusing qualitative data. If you're looking for more guidance or discussion on these issues, there's two sources I highly recommend. First and foremost is a chapter out of Silverman's most recent edition of Qualitative Research. Libby Bishop wrote this chapter specifically on reusing qualitative data, and it's filled with further examples of reuse and addresses these key issues in more depth. There's also a Timescapes Methods Guide series. It's short, it's just a few pages, from Sarah Irwin and Mandy Winterton, but it's also a great guide to help you get started. There are other resources available through our website. If you explore the Use Data tab, you can find tips for reusing both quantitative and qualitative research. And here you can see there's a short guide as well as a bibliography of sources that can help you get started. Finally, I just want to go through a couple of the ways to look for qualitative data. So we have two ways that you may have seen before. The first is by going to Key Data, and there's a Qualitative and Mixed Methods tab. And there is also, if you know the type of quantitative data you're looking for, you can find some key data that way. And the other is by going through our catalog, Discover, which works a bit like Google. You simply search using a keyword, as is done in that screenshot with food. Then you can filter down the type of data you'd like to see using the facets on the left-hand side of the page. However, there's also a relatively new tool which is specific to qualitative data, and that's QualiBank. Like Discover, you simply type in a keyword such as typhoid, but as done here. But instead of searching through abstracts and catalog pages like Discover does, QualiBank actually searches through the data itself. And this means you may be able to identify relevant interviews that may be spread across different collections, or find a collection where you didn't think that theme would actually come up. And when you click on one of your search results, you come to a page like this. At the top of the page, you can see there is a link to external resources and collection documentation. If you click on either of those, they'll bring you down to the bottom after the interview transcript ends, and it'll actually link you to those particular resources. This could include things like audio extracts of the transcripts. There might be images related to the interview. Sometimes there's also web resources. Finally, if you want to cite directly from an interview transcript, you can do so using the Create Citation button in the left-hand margin. So you would click on Create Citation, and it would prompt you to highlight the part of the transcript that you'd like to cite. And then that button will switch and say Retrieve Citation. And when you click on Retrieve Citation, it will come up with a pop-up box that looks a bit like this. And this citation has a persistent identifier. It's the URL at the end. And if someone were to actually follow that URL, it would bring them into QualiDank to that specific paragraph that you've highlighted in your citation. And this is particularly useful if you're interested in creating more transparency, allowing people who perhaps might read a publication to have just a bit more context of what's going on. Again, this is just another added feature, basically, that you can use to help you just create more transparent qualitative research. Okay, so that's it for qualitative data. But before I go, I just wanted to highlight a couple of upcoming dates. As we're coming up to the summer, there's not many events as there might usually be. So this is the last of the webinar series for this term. There will be more announced later, so keep your eye out for those. I did want to mention a couple of funding opportunities that might be of interest. And the first is an open call by the ESRC for the SDAI, and this is the Secondary Data Analysis Initiative. This is a rolling application system, but they meet to decide award winners next in July. You can apply for up to £200,000, and your project obviously must involve some sort of secondary data analysis. The other bit of funding that's coming up is our Data Impact Fellows. The deadline for these applications is the 15th of August, and the idea behind this is to help raise awareness about your research. So you can use the money to help, for example, put toward an international conference or to pay publishing fees, etc. We've also got a week-long summer school at University of Essex on big data if you're interested in analyzing big data. All right, that is it for our webinar today.
I'll just quickly show the website for anyone who's interested, just to see what that looks like. What Maureen was saying about, where to find the data, you've got Get Data up here. You can either search here, which would search the catalogue, or you can click into Key Data. And you can see all the different kinds of data that we have available. And these are just the key data sets, so they're the most commonly used ones, really. So it's not the whole collection, but you can see there's lots of different kinds, lots of different topics. And there's, for example, amongst the UK surveys, which are the repeated cross-sectional surveys, there's, for example, a health survey, there's ones about income, family expenditure, there's all sorts of stuff here. Something about British social attitudes, which is common. There's cross-national surveys, longitudinal studies. Amongst these, there's the Understanding Society, which was the one that I was talking about in my talk. But there's others as well. And these are the ones that can be used for looking at individual change, because they follow individuals each time the survey is conducted. So it's the same people, whereas these UK surveys, it's a different sample each time. We have other varieties of data which you can explore for yourself, and these are the ones that Maureen was referring to, the qualitative and mixed methods data. So again, these are just the key data sets, so the most commonly used ones. Another thing that you could do to find data is to just search and discover. And I won't talk about this in any detail. You can see that at the top left here, you've got where it says Discover highlighted. And if I just type in crime, it's going to search the titles of surveys or any other data set and in the abstract. So it will return many results, no doubt. And I can show a different number of results per page. I can sort them differently. And if you look along the left-hand side, there's lots of ways of refining this. There's also a variable and question bank. This is specifically for quantitative data. Obviously, it's certainly just a selection of the main survey that are included in this. And if you conduct a search here, then what you'll do is, I'm not sure crime is going to be a good choice, but let's give it a go. It's searching the actual names of the variables within surveys. Okay, so here we have one that's called crime and has the question, do you have crime, violence, vandalism in the area? This is from the Family Resources Survey, and you can follow that through to the pages about that. And then this is what Maureen was talking about for a Quali Bank. Okay. And as we were saying, one of the key things to remember, let me see if I can find something that I'm familiar with. No, let's have a look at crime. Oops, crime. There we go. Crime. If I just go to, say, British Crime Survey, just to pick the very first one that's come up. And this is the catalogue page, and this contains all the information that you should need to know in order to understand your data set. And it's very important that you read certainly as much of this as you need. It's well worth starting off looking at the abstract if it's something you're unfamiliar with. This coverage, universal methodology, very useful. And obviously right down at the bottom here you've got all these various PDFs which contain the questionnaires, etc. Anyway, and the last thing was news and events, which you can see to the top right here. If I click on that and I click on events, you can see all forthcoming events. Okay, and if you click on past events, then you'll be able to find all past events, and you'll be able to see the slides and hopefully a recording of this if you'd like to listen again. You'll see that there are actually a few webinars coming up. There's one coming up, when is that? Is that tomorrow? Yes, about how to find data in Europe. And there's one about data management basics and various others that are coming up either by us or by other organisations that are funded by the ESRC, who also advertise on our pages. Anyway, I think I'll leave it for now then. We have not had any questions, so is there anything you wanted to add, Maureen?
No, I think that covers it. If you do have any questions, do feel free to drop us an email, and it'll get, you know, whether it's about quantitative or qualitative, it'll get sorted and go to somebody who will be able to answer your question. And you can do that using the web page. You just go to the FAQ, and there's next to FAQ, there's the help and contact. Any of those will have the information on how to get in touch.
Yeah, and those are at the top of the screen.
Mm-hmm.
Top right, if I've just clicked on help, and you can see that sends you first of all to new user page or our frequently asked questions. We also have a student forum, and if none of that is of any use to you, then you can get in touch with us. And basically you, if I just imagine you have a problem with accessing data, I'll just click on that. And this is an email help desk. And what happens is that you fill in all this information, just a little bit about yourself and the kind of user you are. You type in description, what the nature of your question or problem is related to the data that we've got, and then you submit it, and you should receive a response in the next few days. It should end up with somebody who would have a certain amount of expertise on that kind of data, or the access problem, or whatever it is that is the nature of your problem.